It's an honor to share the stage with these folks and to participate in this event. We've spent time talking about society, the institution, the individual, and my task is to bring it back to a topic that deserves more conversation but often doesn't occur in mixed company, and that is the reality of politics and being involved. My name is Jonathon Pelto. I have been part of society and institutions and an individual, graduate of public schools at the elementary, middle school, high school, University of Connecticut, served in the legislature for 10 years as part of the establishment, owned a company that tried to change public policy through advertising and mobilization. And now I serve as a growing field that we will see, I think, develop over time. I call myself an advocacy journalist or an investigative blogger. And that is, with the demise of the mainstream media, how do we talk to people about things that matter? So I'm going to take 15 minutes to do that. As I get older, I find that I have more and more heroes. I was taught as a young person that you have lots of heroes when you're a child, but fewer as you grow older. Dr. Williams is one of my newest heroes, and so it's a particular honor to be on stage with him. I've worked, and we've all worked, and we all should be concerned about a lot of different things, but today I want to talk about one of those that matter, and that's in education. This audience is proof that education matters. Its institution is proof that education matters. The discussion that Dr. Williams began with about the meaning of the American democratic system is proof that education matters. I'd like to describe it as we're come to a crossroads, and on one path is a difficult path with ups and downs and lots of challenges and requires us to help each other. And the other looks more like a superhighway, and it's called education reform, or as I would call it, corporate education reform on behalf of the corporate education reform industry. And that each and every one of us as parents or students or members of society are going to have to deal with which path we go down. The one that takes us much longer and is harder, or the one that I believe is the most serious threat to the very issues that Dr. Williams talks about. And I don't think it's overly dramatic to say that the superhighway is the one that will continue to destroy the fundamental values that this country was founded on and has attempted to improve upon for over 220 years. In fact, we have a pretty good public education system in this country. The narrative is that somehow we are failing. And that's because, more often than not, it's judged by where we stand on standardized test scores. There's all kinds of reasons that we score lower, in part because we have a true public education system that tries to provide educational opportunities to everybody. And so by taking everybody, we're a society that doesn't simply measure the elite. And when you measure everybody, you get the diversity of everybody, strong and weak, and the notion that everybody can learn, but not everybody can learn at the same rate at the same time. So public education is about creating citizens, people who could serve on juries, people who could deal with the diversity that's America, people who could deal with the challenges that is the 21st century, people who can make it through the ups and downs of life. And what we all know, no matter what age we are, is that standardized testing and standardized education is exactly the opposite of what you would need in order to survive in the 21st century. But in fact, we have the greatest single threat to the American system of education, of public education, and I would say to democracy ever. And that's a pretty dramatic statement, that here we are in 2014 and facing the greatest threat to public education in our nation's history. I suppose the good news, if there is such, is that the threat is bipartisan in nature. George W., Jeb, Tom Foley, who's running for governor in Connecticut as a Republican. And on the right, or my left, this particular case, it's irrelevant, we have Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Dan Malloy, and in the middle, people like Arnie Duncan, Rahm Emanuel, Cory Booker, a particular darling who has managed to destroy the Newark public education system almost unilaterally. And so what it is that at a time where Americans believe there are somehow fundamental differences between Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, the Democrats and Republicans have used their differences to prevent the country from going virtually anywhere or dealing with any of the important things, they are coalesced in this attack on public education. I picked two quotes that describe where we stand. The first is from the Secretary of Education, arguably somebody who should know more about a vision for this country than anybody else. And Arne Duncan said that his goal is to be able to look a second grader in the eye and say, you're on track, you're going to be able to go to a good college or you're not. That way of thinking, the development of the Common Core and the Common Core testing, in New York State, where they are 1 year ahead of Connecticut, quote-unquote, discovered that 97% of the people who have language barriers, bilingual, go home to households that don't speak English, 97% were failures, starting in the 3rd grade, and 4th grade, and 5th grade. So that we, in fact, can create a society where we have a small elite, a declining middle class, and a permanent underclass, who have been taught from the very beginning that they are failures, so that we can say to that second grader, you're going to be a failure. But that's okay, because the vast majority of Americans will be failures. And Dan Malloy, who argues that he's progressive on important issues, like gay rights, death penalty, other issues, that he doesn't mind to teaching to the test as long as the test scores go up. So what are the barriers to test scores? Or, in fact, what are the barriers to educational success? Because that's much more important than test scores. It happens, and if you looked at the recent SATs, from the wealthiest to the poorest, there was, on average, a 400-point difference. So, in fact, there are some things about standardized test scores that we can learn, although we can't learn anything about how well the student is going to do. What we can know is that there are tremendous barriers to academic success. In Connecticut, our white suburban students score so well that Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, those students would score 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, or 3rd, 4th, and 5th in the world. And yet we have a tremendous gap between the poor and those who don't speak English. Interestingly enough, our lowest cohort in Connecticut, a failing education state as we're told, our lowest cohort scores better than the average in Louisiana. So the notion of failure is a relative one, and that is we have a big problem in this society. It's called an educational achievement gap, and that is because it is due to poverty, language barriers, and unmet special education needs. Connecticut, the wealthiest state in the world, wealthiest state in the country. If we were our own country, we would be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And yet, in 2001, we were the first state to have a commission that said we were going to cut poverty in this state by 50% within a decade. And when that decade was up, poverty had increased by 50% in this state. Hartford, with half the children living in real poverty. This isn't poverty like you qualify for some kind of reduced lunch prices. This is real poverty, poverty at an international level. And we can see that it's disproportionately, quote-unquote, minorities. But of course, as some of you know, this year is the first year in our public school system in which minorities are now the majority. So we have to be careful about saying minorities and majorities, because what you see is that our system disproportionately devastates our majority. Hartford, Connecticut, the poorest city of its size in the United States. And what does that mean? After allocating about $2 billion at the state level, $2 billion at the local level, really trying to work on spending on education, we have the reality that plagues us. Not the poorest city in the state, not the richest city in the state, but a pretty poor one and a pretty rich one. And we see that the rich town spends about 50% more, 40% more. But what are their challenges? No poverty. No non-English speaking students. No students, or virtually no students, going home to households. I was in a debate today with the number 2, a radio debate, a person who was the number 2 to Michelle Rhee on one of the national public radio stations, and they talked about how great Finland's education system is. It is a great country. My father's side of the family is Finnish, and so I lived there for 2 years. You can't function in Finland unless you speak Finnish. It's a Finno-Ugric language. It's not Indo-European, so it's not easy to pick up. So when they bring in immigrants, which they don't often do, the parents and the children are learning Finnish at the same time because you literally can't take a bus or go to the store. Here we have second and third generation families who don't speak any English. Their children go to school, they come home, they have nobody in the household. We start teaching science in 3rd grade. We give them a standardized test in 5th grade to tell them that they're failures. The homework is in English, the test is in English, and nobody in the household speaks English, and we complain about the lack of parental involvement. By every measure, except the fact that special education needs are pretty similar across lines, a little bit higher in low-income areas. But in Simsbury, every classroom has an instructional assistant, and most special ed students are either on a 1-on-1, a 2-on-1, or 3-on-1. In Bridgeport, the special ed instructional assistant is on a 12-on-1. And this year, because of the budget cuts, the city of Bridgeport decided to do away with all instructional assistants. 20,000 students, no instructional assistants. In Simsbury, every classroom has an instructional assistant. The answer, some people say, is let's privatize higher education. We could spend the whole time, this 2-hour period, talking about the changes in public policy, but basically, the short definition is, and it was started by George W. Bush and dramatically expanded under Barack Obama, is that it is a system that guarantees the privatization of public education by rank ordering every school and then taking the lowest cohort and legally requiring that those schools be privatized or turned around, is the term that they use. And so we have seen an unprecedented level of movement to the private sector because they will do better. Well, first off, we find tremendous problems due to the lack of accountability, lack of certification, the lack of ability to deal with different kinds of students. But this chart really drives home the notion of when you hear somebody say charter schools are better, you should assume that there is a problem with their data analysis. Hartford, Connecticut, 1 in every 5 students who don't speak English. Jamoki Academy, up the street, has 0.2. In 8 years, they have had one student who didn't speak English. And yet they were given a no-bid contract to run the school next door called Milner Academy with 50% bilingual students. And they were given a lucrative no-bid contract before it was discovered that the CEO had served time in prison, 5 years in San Francisco, for embezzlement of public funds and wasn't the Dr. Sharp that he claimed to be. But it's more than that. It's more than simply an attack on education, and it's an attack on unions, it's an attack on teachers. Our governor is the only Democratic governor in the nation to propose doing away with tenure and doing away with collective bargaining in the poorest school districts. And instead of outrage, what we have is what I call the politics of appeasement. Across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, who have decided that it's okay to talk about climate change or poverty or gun control or minimum wage, but somehow it's not okay to talk about this. Those 2 bad federal bills were passed with Democratic support under a Democratic president and a Republican president. Malloy's bill, the most pro-corporate education reform bill of any Democrat in the country, was passed with overwhelming Democratic support. Malloy not only is using the money that we gave him to run his campaign, as is Tom Foley, but they drove loopholes in order to allow for private money to come in, including from the education reformers. And the 2 major unions and teacher unions in Connecticut have both endorsed the American Federation of Teachers without doing any interview or providing any opportunity, and the CEA this week having sent out a brochure to 95,000 teachers with information that crosses the line between being misleading to lying. I'm often come back to this notion and that is having seen it firsthand, experienced it firsthand, and know that any of us who are willing to stand up and be counted will be treated that way. They ignore you, they laugh at you, they fight you, and then you win. And sometimes you get pushed back and forth between fighting and their desire to ignore you once again. But as we think about the things that were said earlier, about society, about the institution of higher education, about ourselves as individuals, I think we try as best we can to remember Gandhi's observation about how change really occurs. And then finally, today in particular, I wanted to leave you, many of you may not know, Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. She took over in an uprising on the part of teachers who dumped their pro-corporate education teachers union. She took them to strike, not on the basis of getting more benefits or salary, but on the benefit of changing, getting smaller class sizes. And unfortunately, she was diagnosed with brain cancer and is in serious condition after 5 hours of surgery the other day. So I thank you for listening to me, and I urge you to join in the effort so that one day we can all win. Thank you very much.